Hello and welcome. In this age of turbulence and the gusts of macro headwinds, you need an expert to navigate you through this. Joining me is one of the keenest minds in the business, Dr. Gerard Lyons. He's Chief Economist and Group Head of Global Research of Stanchart. A pleasure having you on the show, Gerard.
Pleasure to be here.
Let me start with your view on India. How different is 2008 from 2007?
Well, similar to 2007. The big difference between 2008 and 2007 is in the mind of investors and the public. Last year, people here in India were very bullish, very upbeat. This year, people have gone to the other extreme, very pessimistic. The fundamentals have not really shifted that much, but they have shifted. The outlook for India is tighter policy, slower growth, rising inflation, and the inevitability, in my mind, of a weaker equity market and a much tougher financial and business environment.
You seem to suggest it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah. Well, in saying getting worse before it gets better, I think it's important to say that India is in pretty good shape. And India, indeed, like many other economies, have sort of boomed in recent years. So the growth picture for India in recent years has been one of good stories, good news, optimism, and everything seems to be going up. So when we talk about a more difficult time for India, I think it needs to be put in the context of where India has been in recent years. So when one looks at India for the next 12, 18 months, yes, it will get worse before it gets better. It's more a cyclical slowdown, a tougher economic climate, tougher business climate, and also some difficult policy decisions having to be made. But the longer-term outlook for India is, in my view, very positive indeed.
Okay, I'm going to talk about perhaps the toughest decision India needs to make right now, and that's in the case of inflation. You're endorsing there's no recourse but shock therapy now.
Well, I don't know if it needs to be shock therapy, but I think gradualism has been the policy to date. Basically, India does have some inflation. The inflation that India had in 2 or 3 years ago was basically because the economy was growing too strongly. It was what economists might call demand pull inflation. Now we have a more sort of cost-driven inflation because of high food prices, higher petroleum prices. Now, some of those pressures may well ease in the next 6 to 12 months, but certainly for the moment, and certainly over the next 6 months, there's going to be further cost pressures. So the authorities have to face up to the need to both slow the pace of growth in the economy to a more sustainable rate, and at the same time do what they can to sort of dampen down cost increases. But it's very hard for the authorities here in India to sort of take control of oil prices. So what the authorities have to look at is how those cost pressures are feeding through. Are they leading to higher inflation expectations? Are they leading to unsubstantiated, unjustified pay increases? And if inflation expectations and if wages are picking up, then the Reserve Bank of India and the authorities in general need to do more. And in my mind, there's evidence of higher inflation expectations, higher wage increases. So to make sure that inflation doesn't become too embedded at too high a rate, I think policy needs to be tightened further. Of course, because the authorities maybe didn't tighten enough in previous years, there's always the danger of doing too much too late. And that's the challenge in the next sort of year or so for India.
Let me get into specifics of this tightening. You're saying about 100 basis points, maybe in 2 tranches each on the repo rate as well as the reverse repo rate, and a 75 bips hike in CRR?
Yes. Well, I think it actually needs to be more than even those measures. I think one needs to take into account how fiscal policy can play a part and also how the currency can play a part. But first and foremost, yes, the authorities need to tighten monetary policy through the more traditional measures. And indeed, try and dampen down the bank's enthusiasm to lend as well through moral suasion. So we need to see a broad range of measures to try and slow the pace of growth. And the important measure and the point to get across here is India has boomed in recent years. Booms can often become busts because they self-correct. What the authorities are trying to do is make sure it doesn't become a bust, but is more a case of going from strong, substantial growth to more modest and more sustainable growth.
Is it possible that GDP will now stay above 7.5%? Or are you making the case that we should be ready or prepare ourselves for a 7% GDP growth rate?
Well, 7.5% is a good guesstimate for where growth will be. But if growth dips below that, then I think it will be more temporary than sort of ongoing. But even 7.5% is a slowdown from where we've been in recent years. The way one might describe India at the moment, and indeed it's not just India, is a stagflation. But when you say stagflation, many people think, what do you mean by that? Stagflation means slower growth, rising inflation. It has dreaded sort of connotations because the West had stagflation back in the 70s when inflation was very high rates and growth really slowed sharply. Now, the challenge, and it's not just for India, it's China and emerging developing countries, is to make sure that we don't get to that stagflation environment for the emerging world of very, very high rates of inflation and sharply slower growth. For the moment, things look more like it's a case of growth going from very high rates to more modest rates and inflation being in the teens rather than going above 20%. But that in itself is a challenge. But it's not just, as I say, what's happening here. It's also important to look at some of the imported cost pressures. Therefore, a stronger currency can play a part. And the biggest challenge is oil prices. And oil prices have been driven higher by a whole range of factors. Strong demand, tight supply, environmental concerns, strategic buying of particular types of oil by, for instance, the Americans, and of course the speculative element. I know that your finance minister has blamed high oil prices solely on the speculators. The reality is speculators are more the froth on the top of the market. They've driven oil maybe up to the extra $20 or $25. But oil has been driven up by a whole host of factors, including demand-supply factors. I think if the speculators are driven out of the oil market, that will bring oil down to a more sustainable level, but still above $100. But if oil goes much below that, then it's going to be because global growth and global demand has slowed significantly. So you don't always want to get what you wish for sometimes. Whilst people here in India might want to have much, much lower rates of oil prices, the only way in which in the next year we will get much, much lower rates of oil prices is if global growth really slows. So what we really want to do is see the speculators driven out of the market, but even if that happens, oil prices will probably still be hovering around or above slightly $100.